argue that there is a need for critical innovation solutions that align with agricultural productivity, and voluntary certification pathways promise and a way to achieve both conservation and agricultural objectives. So I think much like what Deborah said. So I'm going to start with the doom and gloom picture, just so that we are on the same page. So as I mentioned, we are the development arm of the United Nations. And, one of the issues that we grapple with a lot are around issues around food insecurity. So we are increasingly finding a lot of food insecurity across the world, even here in South Africa. We also find a lot of malnutrition, right? We have been driven by this, big, cheap food agenda. And a lot of the times we are wanting to produce as much as possible and make sure that it's accessible to everybody. And that has led to a lot of inputs and pesticides. I mean, if we look at the import figures for pesticides and fertilizers over the last 15 years, South Africa has steadily been increasing its pesticide and fertilizer use. Could be also due to the VAT exemption that exists there, but that's a conversation for another day. So we're big on that. We want to make sure that people are food secure. We want to make sure that we're able to export. We want to make sure that people have access to food. On the other hand, we're finding that we're also grappling with the issues of climate change. We are currently set, initially when we started talking around climate change and curbing climate change, we're talking at a 1.5 degree increase. Right now, the world is currently set at least a 2 degree increase, given the kind of mitigation measures that we've put in place. We're also looking at dwindling biodiversity. I heard somebody mention the Global Biodiversity Framework. Globally, there is some kind of understanding that we do have a biodiversity problem. So, colleagues, what I'm trying to put in front of you here is a situation where we find we have two competing priorities. One is, how do we address the social issues? How do we make sure that people are fed? How do we make sure that, we are producing enough for everybody to be able to eat and to eat well? On the other hand, in order to be able to do this, we are faced with a competing priority of how do we conserve our biodiversity? How do we ensure that we are keeping in check around climate and other issues? So it brings me, so this is part of my framing for the question. When we look at agriculture and conservation, are these competing priorities or are they complementary? And I argue that, at the moment they are competing, but certification could be the bridge to that. I've spoken a lot around, what it is. When we look at agriculture in general, I think a lot of countries have actually looked at agriculture as the backbone, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Agriculture is the backbone of most economies. It's a huge employer, maybe not so much in South Africa, but we do have a large number of farm workers here in the Western Cape, but also across the agricultural value chain. It's a huge employer. Globally, it's estimated that it employs about 2.5 billion people, as per the slide. But at the same time, it contributes about 1/5 of the greenhouse gases emissions, and is, got a reputation for being one of the primary drivers for biodiversity loss. At the same time, agriculture is dependent on biodiversity and the climate. So there is that codependency that exists, if that's the right word for it. So all the people's nutrition, food security are dependent on biological diversity, which offers numerous advantages to livelihoods. Even though now we do find when we speak of agriculture, we think of monocultures and etc. But, if we look at the fair wild, perhaps, there is some room there. The viability of fisheries, agriculture, forestry, and agriculture also depends on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And ecosystem services enable sustained agricultural output. And sometimes, when we're thinking about farming and farming as a business, and we're using lots of pesticides and fertilizers. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we shouldn't use pesticides, we shouldn't use fertilizers, but what I'm looking at is how do we use it in a sustainable manner so that we do not damage the ecosystem and etc. So you will see when they introduced me, they said I'm from UNDP BIOFIN. I'm actually work for UNDP, but specifically manage what we call Biodiversity Finance Initiative flagship program, which is basically BIOFIN. And what we are concerned with, is around the sustainability and the finance around biodiversity conservation. And so when we look at some of these issues, sorry, I'm just trying to find my notes here. So when we look at some of the issues, we are concerned about we have a significant funding gap for biodiversity and private sector actors, including agriculture. I mean, when we look at the farming sector, especially here in South Africa, most of the agricultural sector is dominated by private enterprises or private companies, and they have a role to play in funding conservation through a new norms system. We believe that nature positive economies help biodiversity and livelihoods to flourish. And how do we actually make sure that agriculture contributes towards nature positive economies? Some of the potential economic activities with a minimal zero impact on biodiversity include ecotourism, if properly implemented, and all of these could be incentivized by the state. So I'm sorry, I think I'm looking at an old, but it's fine. It's an old. So what I would like to, and I'm probably now at this stage, you're probably wondering, she's talking about agriculture at a wildlife colloquium. What is going on here? So colleagues, I would like us to just, when we think about agriculture, a lot of times we think of large monocrops, animal husbandry, lots of cows, chickens, pigs, plants, etc. In South Africa, I would like to believe, and I think ranchers such as Barry York will agree with me, that wildlife ranching is a form of agriculture. And, when we've had interactions with, what wildlife ranchers, and they will say to us, listen here, we're not conservationists. That's not our core job. Our core job is actually, we are agriculturists, and their mandate is also covered under the Department of Agriculture and not with the Department of Environment, to some extent, arguably, maybe. Yeah, so, but at the same time, we do understand that, somebody was speaking about lion captivity and, generally wildlife ranching in South Africa, although it does contribute a significant amount to our GDP, has received a bad reputation, right? It's around, the captive breeding, it's around, the monobreeding and, all the other, but it doesn't take away that the majority of wildlife ranches, although agricultural in their nature, are also, as a byproduct, actually conserving nature, right? And so as Biodiversity Finance Initiative of the flagship program, what we're saying is, how do we put in place, perhaps improve the trust within the wildlife sector? And we've partnered with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment to create what we call a wildlife certification standard, which is SWIC, and my colleagues will speak more to that. But basically what we are wanting to do is, how do we ensure that wildlife ranching contributes to the wildlife economy on one end, but also helps to contribute towards sustainable use agenda that the country has? And we believe that this is done through a certification, because if I come to you and I say, for example, sorry, Barry York, Richard is my friend, so I will continue to pick on you. For example, that Mr. York's farm is productive. The moment people hear hunting, the moment people hear, the trophies, they immediately think, no, this is unsustainable. How do we support this? But however, if we do have a credible certification scheme that is behind this and that people have signed on to, that is third-party verified, then there is an opportunity that these wildlife ranches can actually be encouraged. I'm not saying all of them are great, but if there is a standard that they've adhered to that actually speaks to issues around sustainability, environmental sustainability, social sustainability, are we not bridging that gap towards between agriculture and environmental conservation? So I think I've already spoken to this around how this serves as a bridge and how certification schemes can mitigate the negative impacts of agriculture and incentivize business to adopt environmentally friendly and social practices and enable the achievement of the global goals. For example, the global GBF sometimes if standards will enable perhaps some of these ranches to actually now be considered OECMs, and that expansion and help contribute to target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which speaks to expansion of the conservation estate. I'm just going to breeze through these because I think I've taken up a lot of time. But just to look at the challenges and role of policy, just to link to the previous session before. When we want to incentivize agriculture or private sector to actually contribute towards biodiversity conservation, government needs to come in. There needs to be an enabling policy environment. And so beyond the stick, what kind of carrot mechanisms are being put in place? I've heard a lot of people this morning talk about TOPS, talks about CITES and ETC. To what extent do we enable that bridge so that the two are complementary and not competing? The other thing that I just want to talk about here is, the challenges is around greenwashing as well. So, the speaker who came before me did speak around, third-party verification. And, in some instances, we really need to be careful that what we endorse really doesn't then end up with greenwashing, because then what we do is we then put in place the bridge becomes shaky. Now, when we say get on the bridge, let's use the certification standard to bridge the gap, then people don't want to use the certification standard because there's been so much greenwashing put in place. But just to emphasize finally is that there is a role for certification standards, and we need to be able to use them in a credible way so that we can be able to bridge the biodiversity and conservation goals that we have as a country. So thank you.